The President of the United States, Donald Trump, has just posted a statement on Truth Social. This is the first public acknowledgement by the United States. I will read it for you, just seeing this pop up on my phone as we speak while texting back and forth with senior advisors at the White House. From the President of the United States, the United States of America has successfully carried out a large-scale strike against Venezuela and its leader, President Nicolas Maduro, who has been, along with his wife, captured and flown out of the country. This operation was done in conjunction with U.S. law enforcement. Details to follow, according to the president. There will be a news conference, he says, today at 11 a.m. at Mar-a-Lago. He then punctuates it, as he often does, with thanks for your attention to this matter. It is signed by the president. So, again, I want to repeat two of the key sentences in there. He confirms that the U.S. carried out this large-scale strike against Venezuela, and he says that its leader, President Nicolas Maduro, who has been, along with his wife, captured and flown out of the country. So, according to the President of the United States, Nicolas Maduro is no longer on the ground in Venezuela. It leaves open a bit of a vacuum there in terms of leadership. It's not entirely clear who is effectively running that country at this time. I just want to get your immediate reaction to the news that we are hearing again in a Truth Social post from the President of the United States.
Well, this changes everything. This means that this was a regime change operation and that this was had some degree of coordination. Witnesses earlier described helicopters. Witnesses described low-flying aircraft. I was taken aback by what you just said, that Nicolas Maduro and his wife have been taken into custody. That means there were either local forces on the ground or local forces working with Americans to hand over the leader and bring him out of the country. An extraordinary development. We just saw a regime change operation take place quickly in the early hours. You said, does it leave a power vacuum? I know that for the last several months, there have been conversations going on through intermediaries with the generals and the top leaders around Maduro, trying to convince them to turn on him, to hand him over, to allow him to be arrested, and to get him to use the phrase what we had heard earlier, to cry uncle. He wasn't crying uncle, and now it seems he was arrested. An extraordinary development.
Now,
it
Richard,
started out with some boat strikes, and then to a military campaign on land, and now a military operation and an arrest.
And Richard, that, of course, it opens up a lot.
Development.
I apologize for interrupting again. That breaking news that, according to the President of the United States, the U.S. has now successfully launched, carried out, as he says, what was a large-scale strike attacks in and around Caracas, the capital city of Venezuela. Beyond that, he says that the U.S. has captured, and flown out of the country Nicolas Maduro and his wife. And Richard, I bring this up because it's significant for a variety of reasons. Nicolas Maduro, only a matter of days ago, said in a new interview that he was open to negotiating with Washington to combat drug trafficking, the first sign that this pressure campaign was taking its toll. The questions that it raises now are, was there any resistance by Maduro when this took place? Was this in some way negotiated with those around him? Those are questions we have on the ground. As you say, the U.S. swept in and did this under the veil of darkness. It took place very quickly. We don't know what may have occurred on the ground right now, but it raises a lot of real questions about what, if any, conversations did exist in any form with Nicolas Maduro, or if this was the first contact when, in effect, the United States military was knocking on his door and sweeping up him and his wife and taking them out of the country. Panama too.
Noriega, those who remember the story. He was accused of being a narco trafficker, refused to leave. U.S. forces swept in and grabbed him. To answer some of the questions, I know for the last several months there have been contacts through intermediaries with Maduro's inner circle to try to convince him to leave the country. He was not interested. He was resisting. This pressure campaign has been escalating. First with the boats, then with President Trump declaring him a narco-terrorist, then all of the U.S. military buildup in the region, the aircraft carrier strike groups, the submarines, the drones, aircraft. Then, shortly before New Year's, a land strike allegedly carried out by the CIA. Very few details about what was hit then. And now, overnight, a capture operation. You don't do a capture operation without attacking some military sites, because you need to clear the airspace, you need to clear away air defenses, you need to protect the helicopters and the troops that are going in to remove the person you're trying to arrest. So the U.S., President Trump, just decided to pull a Panama II for New Year's and effect regime change in Venezuela. An extraordinary development. And you asked, was this coordinated? It could only have been coordinated with at least some people who turned on Maduro, because the people knew where he was. They knew where his family was. It sounds like he is still alive, and I would not be surprised if we see him in front of an American court in the coming weeks or months.
So this has been a dramatic series of developments taking place overnight in the early hours of this new year, January 3rd, shortly after 2 o'clock local time. The first reports from eyewitnesses on the ground of explosions taking place in and around the capital city of Caracas, Venezuela. And now, within a matter of minutes ago, we are hearing from the president again, detailing publicly, among other things, that the U.S. was behind what he described as a large-scale strike against Venezuela and its leader, Nicolas Maduro. He says Maduro has been captured and flown out of the country alongside his wife. The president does not detail where they are being taken at this time. The president, who remains at his Mar-a-Lago estate, his property in Palm Beach, Florida, says that this operation was done in conjunction with U.S. law enforcement, and says that there will be orders and the American people at a news conference to take place at about 11 o'clock, excuse me, Eastern time. I want to get back to Gabe Gutierrez, if I can, right now. He is our senior White House correspondent. Gabe, you're joining us by phone as well. You've been traveling with the president there, speaking to some of his aides and allies over the course of the last week, while most people were enjoying their holiday break. But the White House has been very focused on a variety of things. One, what's been taking place in Venezuela with a new series of boat strikes in recent days. That strike on a docking facility that the president himself revealed, though the U.S. has not said if the CIA was behind it. Separately, they've been focused on the situation between Russia and Ukraine as well. But the president, Gabe, as you and I have discussed together, has said publicly throughout that the desire is to end the transportation of illegal drugs into the United States, and the White House has sort of pushed back on the idea that this focus has been regime change. So the president himself said in an interview not long ago that Maduro's days were in effect numbered. This is a significant, notable change, and it does impact the U.S. in terms of its policy as it relates to Venezuela and to that region.
Oh, Peter, this is just staggering news, that announcement by the president that not only did the U.S. carry out these strikes, but actually has captured Nicolas Maduro. And you're right, Peter, we have had conflicting messages from this administration over the past several months on what was the goal of these boat strikes and of this military buildup in the Caribbean. Certainly, a lot of skeptics of the administration wondered why send so many troops to the Caribbean just for, airstrikes on these alleged drug boats in and around the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific. And now it appears that this a coordinated attack, an operation to remove Nicolas Maduro from power is just staggering news. And we had been hearing for quite some time, Peter, for the last several months. I remember speaking with some officials within the administration who did say that there had been some talks with members of Nicolas Maduro's inner circle, and that the administration was trying to get at least some of them to turn on Nicolas Maduro. Of course, we have many questions now about how exactly all this went down. What were the details? Did someone turn him in? How did this operation go down in the middle of the night? just after a holiday week. Certainly, we will hope to learn more of those details when the president speaks later on today in South Florida. But something I will bring up, Peter, and something we have not discussed, what happens now with leadership in Venezuela?
Right.
It was not very long ago that the leading Venezuelan opposition figure, Maria Corina Machado, she actually was recognized and accepted the Nobel Peace Prize for fighting for democracy. And she made this incredible, daring journey from being in hiding in Venezuela to collect her prize in Norway, despite government restrictions. So you remember during the first Trump administration, the president backed the opposition candidate then, Juan Guaido, while there were government protests back then, ongoing blackouts, hyperinflation, and unrest inside Venezuela. But those protests fizzled, and Maduro stayed in power. Clearly, that is not the case this time, and many questions about the future of leadership in that country now.
Gabe, stay with us. Richard Engel, stay with us. To our viewers who are waking up and watching this this historic moment with us right now, the United States, in the words of the president, has successfully carried out a large-scale strike against Venezuela. The president adds that both its leader, Nicolas Maduro, and his wife have been captured and taken out of the country. Joining us now from the ground in Caracas, that is the capital city of Venezuela, is journalist Vanessa Herrero. Vanessa, I know you have heard the president's statement. You have seen what he has said. A matter of minutes ago when we spoke to you, you were reacting to strikes on the ground. Now you're reacting for the first time live to word that there is no longer a President Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela right now. I want to get your reaction and what, if anything, you're hearing from those who are awake at this early hour there.
Well, I think, as you all said, this is a historic moment. If this, Trump just confirmed this, but of course, when the footage, the pictures, the story about how he was caught, if he resisted or not, what happened, when exactly, come to light, I'm sure we're gonna see a great deal of reaction, not only around Caracas, but in the entire country. This is exactly a moment in history. I mean, we're talking about 20 years of Chavismo just vanishing in over a night, over hours, not even a night, hours. I mean, this situation really, I believe now more than ever, now that Donald Trump just tweeted that, said that on his Truth Social, that I believe that this strike was absolutely caught out of the blue, caught unaware the Venezuelan government. I'm sorry, I'm stumbling there, but it's really huge news right now.
No, Ana Vanessa, I appreciate your being with us right now. The first voice from inside Venezuela, sharing the experiences you've had, what you have seen there. If you can just take a breath for a moment. You know the situation about as well as anybody. You've covered that region, spent so much time clearly in Venezuela. Just your gut, when you heard that news, what was your reaction?
I was absolutely shocked, to be honest. I didn't believe this could be possible. I still don't know. I still don't know what is happening right now. We don't have confirmation again about, at least from Venezuela. We don't have anyone saying that this happened or how it happened. But there are a lot of videos flowing around WhatsApp and social media showing helicopters near what they claim, the people recording claim to be the house of high government officials, Delcy Rodriguez, Jorge Rodriguez, Diosdado Cabello. We haven't heard from them. So We do know now about Nicolás Maduro and Cilia Flores, but we don't know about, for example, Maduro's number two, Diosdado Cabello, who's also a huge name for the U.S. government. We have no confirmation of his whereabouts. We don't know if his was affected by the strike, if he was in Caracas at the moment. We just don't know.
Well, Ana Vanessa, you know what's striking to me is we obviously need to get a better understanding from the White House and from others about the timeline that took place here. But we did quickly get a statement from the Venezuelan government after these strikes began, saying in effect that this was an extremely serious military act of aggression. Yeah. So it raises questions about if Nicolás Maduro was no longer in a position to be leading, who is leading, who in the system is still governing, in effect, to be putting out these defiant statements directed at the United States, and what, if any, plan exists to help try to stabilize that country, as it were, in the immediate days and weeks that may follow here, without its leader, though a leader that the U.S. described as the head of a narco-terrorist state, without its presence there on the ground?
Well, it is unknown because we just know, as I was telling you, we only know about Nicolás Maduro and Cilia Flores. We don't know, for example, about Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president, or Jorge Rodriguez, the head of the Chavista-controlled Congress and the parliament. So we don't know, for example, if Delcy Rodriguez is still here, she should, she's still in Venezuela, if she's not affected, she wasn't affected by the strikes, then we should hear from her in order to understand what's going to happen next. But if the high members, 6 or 7 high members of the Venezuelan government, Nicolás Maduro's government, were also maybe taken or affected, then we don't know what would the protocol be. We do know that Nobel laureate Maria Corina Machado, who is a key ally to Edmundo González, who was the winner of 2024 elections, according to the vote tallies. We do know that she said that they have the transition already to start whenever Nicolás Maduro was out of power. So maybe we can expect the opposition to take the place and start this this so-called transition into maybe new elections.
Ana Vanessa Herrero, we are so grateful that we've been able to speak to you live for our rolling coverage of this historic developing news we've been watching from the ground in Caracas, Venezuela again. And we repeat it because it's so dramatic and I think, frankly, for a lot of people, quite stunning, as Ana Vanessa herself just said. The President of the United States making very clear that the U.S. has successfully carried out a large-scale strike in Caracas, Venezuela, that country's capital city, and the president says that its president, Nicolás Maduro, has been captured. He, alongside his wife, have been taken out of the country by the United States. I want, if I can, very quickly, to get back to Richard Engel, our chief foreign correspondent, for a moment. Richard, do you hear me?
Extraordinary development.
Richard, where does the U.S. take, I apologize for interrupting, where could the U.S. take Nicolás Maduro at a moment like this?
Well, you would take him into U.S. custody. You would take him to a warship because they were talking about helicopters. So you would take him to some sort of warship, and then from a warship, flown back to the United States. Again, this is very similar to Panama, very similar to Noriega. The U.S. went in, grabbed him, and then once he's in custody. So there are a series of steps, but these are the kind of operations that are carried out by Navy SEALs, Delta Force, close coordination with the CIA. The United States has some experience with this. The United States for decades was involved in a war on terrorism, is involved in in kill and capture operations all over the world. It would have been much easier to carry out an assassination campaign and clearly the United States knew where Nicolas Maduro was. Clearly there was coordination on the inside. It would have been far easier to do what Israel did in Iran: pick your target and carry out an assassination strike. But it seems that they wanted to arrest him. They wanted him in custody. And the closest place that is American custody would be a warship, and then from the warship to the U.S. mainland. So I would be expecting that we will see Nicolas Maduro in front of an American court before too long, and it will be a moment for Marco Rubio to celebrate, a way for the Trump administration to prove it's serious about exerting its force in Latin America. Let's not forget one of the first things President Trump did was call the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. He clearly wants to show dominance in America's backyard, and he has just carried out I don't want to say breathtaking, but a surprise secret operation. The Venezuelan journalist you were talking to a short while ago said that she was shocked by this news. Peter, we were on air when this news came in. I almost asked you to repeat it. Did you really say the U.S. just went in and arrested Maduro?
Yeah.
Clearly they did. He had not been responding to the escalating pressure campaign. He had not been crying uncle. He had recently said that he was willing to negotiate. He was willing to collaborate. He was willing to find out a solution. It reminds me of the days of Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein in Iraq, when he was arrested, he'd been hiding in a hole, and the first thing he did is he put up his hands and he said, "I am Saddam Hussein, and I am willing to negotiate." It was too late for negotiations at that stage, and he was taken into custody and then ultimately handed over to the Iraqis and executed. I think at this stage, Nicolas Maduro, who has already been called a terrorist, already been charged with narco crimes, will end up facing an American court and probably being sentenced to a litany of crimes.
Richard, I want to marinate in this moment for a sec about whatever type of operation it would require to be able to go in there and sweep up Nicolas Maduro, to take his wife with him as well out of that country. As the president said, the circumstances, of course, are very different, but there have been other operations that have been veiled in secrecy, that stunned in many ways the world. You've been talking about the situation with Saddam Hussein, the very different circumstances. The United States back in 2011, of course, was able to go into Abbottabad, Pakistan, where they found Osama bin Laden, who had been hiding out there. That was a very different desire. He was not the leader of any country, of course. In fact, he was a terrorist leader, and he was killed in the course of that operation. But the U.S. ability to do this in secrecy, and at least to this point, we're waiting for any information about whether any Americans, whether there was any resistance, whether arms were fired at American troops, or whether the situation was not too dissimilar to the one you detail with Saddam Hussein, where he just put his hands up at the time. But the U.S. has, it reminds Americans of the unique capabilities the U.S. has when the orders come from the President of the United States, with the military involved, to do something of such a high and dramatic scale like this.
This would be the helicopter operation. You can't land a fixed-wing aircraft in the middle of a city. And witnesses in Caracas described hearing helicopters. So the reason you do a wide-scale military operation is to make sure that the forces going in are protected. Venezuela does have allies in Russia, does have anti-aircraft systems. Its military is a bit of a shambles. The country is under sanctions. There is an elite that has a lot of money, and then a great deal of poverty. Most of the refugees that are spreading around across Latin America, many of them come from Venezuela itself. So an impoverished nation that had been run by a dictator who has now been arrested. But it definitely demonstrates the U.S. capabilities. And I stress, because I've been speaking to mediators for months now, there has been an escalating pressure campaign directed not just on Maduro, but around his inner circle, the military around him, to hand him over. And Maduro's response was either to laugh it off. If you remember, he was seen in holding rallies, singing John Lennon songs, saying, "Imagine a time we can have peace." He was saying that this was just a great big American Yankee imperial plot, and he wasn't getting the message. People around him clearly got worried, and it seems like someone turned him in. With the U.S. military pressure in the region, with the strikes on the boats, and then that strike on land just before New Year's, I think you can see these now, how they line up, leading to what we saw overnight, an escalating campaign of military presence, boat strikes, a land strike, back-channel negotiations to get the inner circle to turn on Maduro, and now a capture operation. You mentioned Osama bin Laden. That was a kill operation. Kill operations are much easier. You know where he is, you bomb it,
right.
It's over. But the Trump administration clearly wanted to take him, go power, and put him in front of a court.
Just to pull back the curtain to let our audience in on some of what happens behind the scenes during developments like this, we have been reaching out to to those who work at the White House and the Pentagon as well for any additional details. I've been texting as we speak with officials in and around the White House for any better details. We've now been asking where Nicolas Maduro has been taken, is being taken. They have yet to respond to that. Again, the president saying that he will hold a news conference to take place at about 11 o'clock, which is, what, if it's almost 5 o'clock here, roughly 6 hours from now.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.